Hello to you all. My name is Maria Rita. I'm the Executive Director of Anjos do Brasil, a non-profit organization to foster angel investment. I welcome you all to this 50th edition of Café com Homus, an initiative of Anjos do Brasil and Israel Trade and Investment, which brings big names in the Israeli innovation ecosystem to share their vision on issues related to venture capital and startups. In addition to discussing the potential of business and investments between Brazil and Israel. Brazilians love coffee, and to have a cafezinho, it's always a way to connect and talk about business. And every time that I go to Israel, someone says to me, you have to try Homus in this or in that restaurant. It's the best one. Let's go together. So for me and for Luciana, the Director of Business Development at Israel Trade, it was the best name for this event, since we aim for sharing knowledge and making connections. But we are not here to talk about food. We are here to talk about innovation. And for that, we have the honor to receive Mr. Eugene Kandel. Thank you so much for having the time to talk to us. Anjos do Brasil and Israel Trade and Investments have a long partnership. We organize investors' missions to Israel, events like this, and a lot of connections between entrepreneurs and investors. We are certain that there is a huge potential for business that adds value for both our countries. To also welcome you, talk a little bit about the work Israel Trade does, and to introduce our guests, I will give you Tzahi Haish, the head of Israeli Economy and Trade Mission in São Paulo. Tzahi is with you.
Maria Rita, thank you so much. Shalom everyone. Bon dia, אחר הצהריים טובים in Israel. We are glad to have everyone here with us again, and very excited to have a very special guest with us today, Professor Eugene Kandel. Just a word, again, as Maria mentioned, we've been doing a lot of activities together with Anjos, great partnership, and we are very excited of continuing this great collaboration together. We've been doing a lot of missions, both physically before Corona, and now we are planning different virtual activities, virtual delegations, B2B and virtual events. So the work continues even though the world has changed around us. With that, I would like to invite Professor Eugene Kandel for the stage, for the Zoom stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Tzahi. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning. I'm going to share a presentation. So this is hi from Tel Aviv. This is our building. You can see there's a sea over there, the old city of Jaffa. So we are right in the middle of Tel Aviv. We're called Startup Nation Central. And it's you can think of us as the sort of epicenter of Israeli tech ecosystem. So what I want to do is to have an interactive discussion, to the extent that you can do it with so many people, I want to cover three things, and then I'm open to any questions or requests, etc. I want to talk a little bit about Startup Nation Central, about our organization, what do we do. Then I want to talk a little bit how we see the world trends as pertaining to the need for technology and where we see the big opportunities in terms of technological advancement. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the evolution of Israeli ecosystem, which has been, you know, even for us, it was a big surprise that it evolved in Israel, but it was also a surprise for the world. And and where do we take it from there, and what lessons can we learn from this? There will be some post-corona discussion as well, but so I'm going to try to go through this relatively quickly, and then we can have a more sort of interactive discussion. But please do, I don't know why this thing continues. Okay, So Startup Nation Central is an organization, it's a nonprofit, which was inspired by the book Startup Nation by Dan Senor, who is on our board, Saul Singer, who's so the wife of Saul and the sister of Dan, who is the same person. Wendy Singer started this organization in 2013. I've joined in 2015, and until last week, I was the CEO. I resigned last week after almost 6 years, to pursue additional opportunities within the same orbit, doing more policy work. Before I joined the ecosystem, I've been, the Startup Nation Central, I've been a professor of economics and till today, by the way, and finance at the Hebrew University. And between 2009 and 2015, I was the head of the National Economic Council of the Israeli government and the economic advisor of the Prime Minister. So the organization is quite unique in terms of that it's a non-profit funded entirely by philanthropy. It was started by people in New York who wanted to help Israel, and its goals are, it works in 3 areas. It basically tries to promote the Israeli innovative technologies as solutions to the world major challenges. So one thing that we do is we research, collect data, and provide insights based on this data, and then we disseminate these insights in a variety of ways. One of them I'll show you in a second. 2, and based on all this knowledge, we do 2 things. On the one hand, we connect Israeli abilities to the world challenges. We do it in 2 dimensions. One dimension is business driven, where it's basically, connecting a big bank to cyber solutions is a business-driven decision, but it's also impact-driven. Connecting smallholder farmers in India to technologies that can change their lives is a much more impact-driven, even though it still has to cover the costs and make some profit. Otherwise, companies will not do that. So this is just to illustrate. We have hosted over 230 very, very large corporates from around the world, including Brazil, in the last 6 years, created many, many business opportunities, joint ventures, investments, client relationship, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other part of our activity is we actually trying to empower Israel to be a better host for the further development of the innovation ecosystem, including policy work, talent development, finance, communities, impact, et cetera, et cetera. So these are a variety of things. We do not charge for almost anything we do. We sometimes, for example, one of the products that our main sort of core assets is something that is called Finder, which is basically our data that we collect. We make it available for free to everybody who wants to learn about Israeli innovation. It includes over 6,500 companies, almost 600 investors, hubs, multinationals, academic technologies. It just got a facelift and was relaunched 3 days ago. So it looks actually a bit different now. But it's a very, very useful source. Over 60,000 unique users enter it every month. Sorry, not every day, but every month. For such a specialized website, it's a lot of people. In the last 3 years, we realized that we can actually share this technology and methodology with the world. So we started giving this away to countries and regions. So now there is a whole global Finder network, which includes New Zealand, Thailand, Taiwan, Michigan, Texas. We've been in discussions with some organizations in Brazil before the corona. This was my last trip overseas a year and a half ago, was to Brazil. And we're expanding so far in another country in South America and in Africa. So we're actually expanding this as we speak. This allows the local ecosystem to really connect internally, but also expose itself to outside clients and investors. So this is what we do. Now, let me talk a little bit about world trends. These trends, we have chosen these trends not because there are no other trends that might be useful, but because these trends introduce an incredible uncertainty. And these trends are bringing us to something that we've never lived through. So the trends are as follows. So one is the post-crisis world. Post-crisis world, it's post-2008 crisis, but it's also post-corona. So there are now two crises that we have lived through in one decade. And these crises introduced a very interesting situation in which we have low growth, high debt, low inflation, although inflation starts to pick up, but for the last 12, 13 years, it was extremely low. And so we've never been in such situation. Actually, the interest rates are 300 years low. Okay, so we don't have much experience on how to get out of this situation, because all of our experience over the last 100 years was in a very, very different environment. So that's one big uncertainty issue. The rise of developing economies is another issue. The center of gravity of the world economy is rapidly moving towards China, India, and other countries in that region. And that creates a lot of competition for a variety of resources, because hundreds of millions of people moving into middle class every decade, and they want to consume just like middle class consumes. They want to own cars, eat meat, have bigger apartments, etc., and travel. All that puts a lot of strain on resources, including climate resources, but mostly on skilled people resources. And so there's a huge competition, not just for physical resources, but also for people. Climate change is, whether you believe the very pessimistic estimates or whether you are a bit more sort of suspicious about them, it doesn't matter, because the world is moving towards taking action in terms of climate, and that action by itself introduces enormous amount of stress on our economies and will require a lot of technology to address that. So there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. The last two, in my opinion, are the most profound, that will change our world the most. Aging population is a combination of two trends. One trend is that people having fewer people, so the proportion of older people increases, fewer children. And so the proportion of older people increases, the pyramid becoming sort of a box rather than a pyramid. And the second thing is that people live longer. We have every year, for the last 140 years, the maximum life expectancy across countries in the world increased almost linearly. There's no sign of slowing. And so since the envelope of our ability to live longer increases all the time linearly, we're going to have the current kids that are born probably going to live over 90 years old as expected value. What that does, I want to show you something, what that does to the average age of the population. So if you look at 1950, okay, can you see that? Okay, so if you look at 1950, the world is very young. There are a couple of places which have the median age of the population is above 35, but the majority, look at Brazil, the average age, the median age is between 14 and 20. Okay, so it's teenage. The median person is a teenager. Okay, and then let's jump to 1970. Okay, it's still a very, very young place, even younger in some places than before. 2000, suddenly Russia and North America and Australia become much older. They become in the 35 to 40, 40 to 45, and some countries in Europe become even older. We jump to 20. Second. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're back.
There was a glitch in internet, so I reconnected. Sorry. So the punchline is that in 2100, Brazil, according to the UN population division, this is not something that I prepared. Brazil is going to be one of the oldest countries, so the median age is going to be over 50 years old. This is a very, very, very big change. By the way, you're going to be in a good company. There will be many countries with population in those ages. So all the Latin America, by the way, look at Mexico, look at Chile, some countries in Europe, etc. These are demographics. These are, of course, predictions, because most of the people who are going to be alive are only being born today or in the last decade. But still, this is something that is going to affect everything in our lives. It will affect our healthcare systems. It will affect our work. How much do we work? How long do we work? How much do we save? How do we save? How do we plan our cities? How do we plan our transportation? What do we do with all these people? Where do we get the supporting population that will support them? So these things, if you want to understand this, go to Japan, because Japan is already having this issue. There are over 25% of Japanese population is over the age of 65, and Japanese population is shrinking rapidly. From 120 million in 2010, they're going to be 50 million in 2100. So this is going to be it's like a tsunami that is coming at a very, very predictable, steady state. You just see it very far ahead, and very few countries are ready for that. So that is one profound change. And the last profound change is the big data era. This is the technological revolution. This is going again to change everything we do. And sometimes you hear people saying, look, technological revolution, this is not the first one, not the second one, it's probably the fourth or the fifth one. So why is it any different from the steam or electricity or robotics or other revolutions that we had before? And so in the past, all the technological revolutions, the technology replaced muscles. The steam replaced muscles, the electricity replaced muscles, and the robots replaced muscles. The reason that it was very, very different is that this revolution, the technology replaces senses and brains. It no longer replaces muscles. Most of the muscles have been replaced. It replaces senses and brains. And as a result, there are several differences that need to be understood. When you replace muscles, you build a machine that replaces 100 workers. In order to replace the next 100 workers, you have to build another machine and another machine. So if you want to replace 100,000 workers, you need to build 1,000 machines. Now that implies that the demand for machines increases, the demand for workers declines, the costs of machines rises because of demand, and the cost of workers declines. So there is going to be equilibrium where it's no longer efficient to replace workers. In the current technological revolution, there are huge economies of scale. Because if your piece of software replaces and a computer replaces 100 workers, the same piece of software can replace 100,000 workers. So there's no cost. Duplicating electrons is cheap. You don't need to build additional machines and replicate them. So basically, you can utilize economies of scale to a huge extent. Second is that the change when you were replacing muscles was slow and somewhat predictable. So at first it took hundreds of years, then it took dozens of years, then it took tens of years, maybe a decade to introduce really significant technologies. Today, we're talking about months or years, single years. And not only it's very rapid, it's also unpredictable. Think about the smartphone in your pocket, okay? The smartphone in your pocket seems like a trivial thing today, but it's only 14 years ago that it ever appeared, and it took the biggest producers of phones during that time, like Nokia and Motorola and others, by complete surprise. In many cases, it drove them out of the market within 2 years. Okay, so they definitely didn't predict that. Not only they didn't predict that, but we never predicted what kind of effect this phone will have on our lives. Neither did Apple, by the way, or the phones that came after that. So the change will be rapid and unpredictable. And the third part is that the change in the past was gradually moving people from where their muscles were replaced into other industries. So we started 150 years ago with the majority of the population working in agriculture. Today, they moved to manufacturing, and then from manufacturing, they moved to services. Services were 10, 15% 150 years ago. Agriculture was 60%, manufacturing was 40%. Manufacturing increased and then declined, okay? Today, in developed countries, services account for 80% of employment. We're not going to move these people back to agriculture and manufacturing. So all the change is going to have to take place within services. And so how many yoga teachers do you need? That's not, these are the people, or haircuts. How many haircuts do you need? About 90 years ago, John Maynard Keynes was worried about technological unemployment, which he defined as when the pace of technology removing workers or destroying jobs is faster than what we find something for them to do. He was dead wrong, because the employment, not only women moved into employment, but we increased the percentage of employed out of the population steadily between 1930 and 2000. But since then, the developed economies witness a decline in the percentage of employed. So maybe he was just too early for his time. So this is not a clear, it's not clear whether we're there or not, but what is clear is that all these 5 trends by themselves represent terra incognita, because we have not lived through these events in our history, so we can learn from the history. What's absolutely sure that we are going to go through continuous and rapid change that's going to be an equilibrium. The change itself will be an equilibrium. It's going to be very disruptive, scary, but it's going to be inevitable, because if you don't do it, you can postpone it, it will come to you as a boomerang and hit you harder, because you're going to become non-competitive. So we might all as well become comfortable with it. And what's unsettling about it is that it's not that there will be change in one area. It's going to be change, and Corona showed us to what extent this is true. Every aspect of our lives will be affected, and we'll all undergo massive changes, and whoever is not prepared will lose, whether it's individual, companies, countries. So the question in terms of investment, you can invest in disruption, or you can try to preserve the disrupted. You can try to defend the disruptive, by investing in new technologies that can help them. Think about banking, insurance. There's a constant battle between new technologies, some of them trying to disrupt them, and some of them trying to defend them. Investing in this space is hard, but really, really exciting, because that's where the future is. That's where the big returns are going to come. Corona, as crises usually do, really sped up the processes that were sort of simmering. And the reason that it sped them up is because before, some of these processes were considered nice to have, and Corona made them a must, showed that they're possible, and changed psychological barriers, removed many psychological barriers. We discuss in the relevant areas for our discussion today, we identify 4 things that Corona really changed. First of all, there is dramatic change in anything interpersonal. Any interpersonal interaction that was considered to be impossible remotely suddenly became not only possible, but is standard. Okay, it would be difficult for us to arrange this talk. For me to fly to Brazil to spend 3 days, 4 days on this, it will be would be hard to schedule. Suddenly we're saying, wait a minute, we're just so used to this. Why not do it online? It'll take you a few hours of preparation and talk. It'll take us an hour. Look, it's much more efficient. And it's everything. It's work, study, travel, healthcare, leisure, entertainment. I have already attended funerals and weddings online, which is, it's pretty efficient, especially if they take place abroad. All that requires technology. And this technology is also remote solutions, but also their security. And so whether it's AI, big data, because it also generates a lot of data, cyber, digital health, et cetera, edutech or edtech, sorry. The second major trend that Corona intensified is that we suddenly realized, especially the developed countries, is that the idea of global supply chains that was the de rigueur for every large corporation or smaller one, suddenly we realized that it has its downside, which people completely ignored. That a country can, for some reason, close its borders, and you suddenly realize that all your raw materials or all your parts coming from one place that is no longer attainable. And that can happen because of pandemic, it can happen because of political strife, it can happen because that country decided to exert pressure on your country. And so the developed countries, many of them said, no, we're not going to live with this. And so that is shortening the supply chains. It's either onshoring or nearshoring. It's going to be accompanied by an increase in manufacturing costs. And it's going to create all kinds of demands, not just manufacturing, by the way, for food production costs as well. It's going to create a demand for new factories that's going to be resilient. They're going to be more automated because of the labor costs. They're going to be more resilient for failures, more protected in terms of cyber. So the industry 4.0 is going to be a huge issue. Agri-tech is going to be a huge issue. Logistics going to be huge issues, and the technologies associated with it. Finally, because of those things, there's going to be a drastic reduction in transportation, hotels, real estate, retail, brick and mortar retail, and other industries. That's pretty clear, and we're already seeing that, notwithstanding antitrust and other activities by governments. This is definitely going to disrupt this industry. And so what you're going to need is massive employment shock that would require a lot of technology to retrain people, to place them, et cetera. So whether it's ed tech, HR technologies, et cetera, there will be a huge need for those. And finally, when the crisis, the Corona crisis started, we were terrified that Israeli ecosystem will suffer immensely, because most of Israeli investors coming from overseas, and it's been completely, it was known in this industry, in the VC industry, that you never invest long distance. You have to look people in the white of their eyes in order to decide whether you want to put your money into their company. This changed within 3 months. People are putting $100 million investments remotely. That is a huge benefit for any ecosystem that is far away from the major centers of VC funds. So for Israel, I will give you some numbers. I apologize, just I'm sorry, we have a wildfire nearby our home. Not near, but it's getting closer to our little town. So there might be an alarm, and in which case I'm going to have to stop and evacuate. So sorry about that. But let's try to finish before that happens. So this is a very good news for any remote ecosystem which does not have enough. So for Israel, it was a godsend, and I'll show you some numbers a bit later. So these are very, very important in terms of technology demand and the capabilities of remote investing. So now I want to talk to you about Israeli innovation ecosystem in a few minutes. Now, when you talk about Israel and people saying, wow, Israel is so innovative, it's not actually true. There are actually two economies in Israel. One of them is pretty traditional economy, not very exciting, not very highly productive, and very dependent on the government. And then there is another economy, which in Israel, it's the largest economy as a percentage of GDP or people employed in the world, that I portray it as a Zeppelin, which is extremely, extremely productive, very much oriented outside, because the local market in Israel is very small. And so that industry is completely focused on the world markets, usually developed world, but now more and more starting with developing world. And this Zeppelin is in Israel for a variety of reasons, but it could be in other places of the world. So you need to think about Israel as the leader in the world in terms of bifurcation of the economy. Now, let me talk about this Zeppelin economy and where it comes from. So the important part to remember is that it is much less application driven. It's much more deep tech driven, because the sources of innovation coming from tech rather than from the markets, because Israel doesn't have the markets. It is much more startup based than large corporates based, even though these startups starting to sell for $5 to $10 billion, so or IPO, so they're maturing rapidly. It is way more B2B focused, so business to business focused rather than business to customer, because it's much easier to sell to a single big client than to many small clients when you're selling outside of the country. And it's, like I said, it's world focused. So it's from get-go, two guys in a garage are focused on conquering the US market or European market or Japanese market. So let me try to portray this ecosystem in 4 sources of strength. So these are the white parts, and the blue parts are the clusters of sectors that developed as a result of these capabilities, and the numbers below the name are the number of companies that exist, let's say, a month ago or so. So the first one is software, data, and AI. Okay, the source of this cluster, the source of the of the strength in this cluster comes from two separate sources. One is the academic, but this even stronger one is actually the military. The military in Israel, unlike military almost anywhere else, is a producer of technology rather than just user. It's the massive producer of technology and therefore trainer of personnel. Therefore, people coming out of it are incredibly skilled and experienced. And so that explains a lot of new startups that they found. So the immediate two industries that are coming out of this are cybersecurity industry and fintech industry. Cybersecurity coming, this is where we have the knowledge of tech, but we also have the knowledge of demand because Israel is one of the most attacked countries in the world. In fintech, it's a different story. In fintech, the demand comes from outside. Most fintech companies do not even look at the Israeli market. They start from addressing the needs of the world markets. There's also enterprise software, which is a big area, and gaming. There's a big gaming industry, which also comes out of it, but I sort of didn't put them in here, but they also come from data, AI, and software. So then you have another area which also comes from the military. It's sensors, robotics, and drones. For example, the Israeli military was about 15 years ahead of anybody else using drones as a military equipment. And today it's one of the big suppliers of military drones. But the drones moved into civic uses. And so if you combine the sensors, robotics, and drones with software, data, and AI, you get two interesting clusters. Neither one of them has an Israeli market. Israel doesn't have industry, well, to speak of, large industry to speak of, and yet Industry 4.0, Israel is either the third or the fourth country in the world getting VC funding for Industry 4.0. It turns out that its specific skills that were developed for various uses are incredibly important in this area. Similarly, smart mobility, 10 years ago, there were I actually counted them because I was doing something in mobility. There were around 50 companies in Israel that had anything to do with car industry or mobility. Today, there's over 500. And today, every original equipment manufacturer and every tier 1 company has presence in Israel. None of them had 10, 12 years ago. Now, if you take the traditional strength in life sciences, which comes mostly from universities, and you combine it, you get biotech. But biotech combined with software and data and AI becomes a new age of biotech. It's called bioconvergence. If you combine life sciences with sensors, robotics, and drones, and with software and data, you get two incredibly powerful clusters. One of them is digital health, and another medical devices. Digital health and medical devices showed to be incredibly important during Corona, both in terms of dealing with Corona itself, but also in terms of remote medical services. So there are Israeli companies that became very, very sought after in the world because of that. And it's continuously developing. The investments in that industry grew dramatically. And then finally, if you take traditional Israeli strength, because of the needs that we had to figure out how to feed the population in a country with very little water and very little arable land. So we did that over the last 100 years in plant, water, and soil sciences, dairy farms, etc. But the second generation of agri-innovation came when we combined that with sensors, robotics, drones, and software and data. So you get a completely new generation of companies that are rapidly gaining traction around the world, including Brazil, because we have no market for that. All this precision agriculture has no market in Israel because we're way too small for these companies to really utilize their value. So this is the picture of Israeli ecosystem. There are other areas like material sciences, energy, etc., but they're much smaller. So they're less important. So at a glance, we have over 6,500 companies, innovative companies, a lot of venture capital funds, accelerators, incubators, multinational R&D centers, which are they're becoming so many of them that they're becoming a problem because they attract too many people. So we have the TTOs that are very active and 9 public universities that supply data. And of course, I've already spoken about the military. The bottom line is that this ecosystem is the most densely populated as a country in the world, by far, by the way. So just to give you an example, we have one startup for every 1,400 people, which is like 3 times more dense than the next country. We have VC investments almost 3 times larger than per capita, of course, larger than in the US, which is the second largest in the world. So even in absolute terms, Israel is probably number 6 or 7th largest ecosystem in the world. Now, to show you the evolution of that, there are two graphs that describe that. The graph on the left describes the entrance of multinational companies establishing R&D centers in Israel. So we started 20 years ago with 50 of them, and then it grew to almost 400, so 8-time increase. Like I said, today they already represent a problem of sorts because they employ almost half of all of our programmers and engineers. But it's a vote of confidence from it's the only country that I think that within 100 miles, less than 100 miles, you can work for any technology company in the world, from Chinese companies to European to American to any company in the world. You will find it and you can work for it. The graph on the right is the supplementary one. So you can see that between 2000 and 2012, the amount of VC investment was hovering between $1 and $2 billion per year. And suddenly, over the last 9 years, until 2019, and went from, sorry, it's not 9, it's actually 8. I think there's a mistake. It went from 2 to 8, so it quadrupled in 7 years. And then, like I said, in 2020, we were really worried, but at the end, the numbers went from 8 billion to 10.5 billion, over 25% increase. And we thought that was some outliers, but it turns out that in the first 5 months of 2021, we had the same amount was invested in 5 months. Now, how do you explain that? Do we see, 5 times more startups is being established? The answer is no. What's going on is that our ecosystem is maturing. Companies are there are probably close to 40 unicorns. In terms of unicorns, in the last 3 years, Israel developed more unicorns than any other country in Europe. Of course, we can't compare with the US, but even countries that are 10 times larger than us in terms of population, we had more unicorns developed during that time. So this is very, very strong performance. And so the question is, how did we get to this? If you were to ask me or anybody else in the late 80s or even early 90s, whether we're going to be here, even in the mid 90s, would have said that this is daydreaming. But it turns out that a bunch of things that got together allowed us to do that. First of all, the Israeli innovation developed through the combination of needs, existential needs, and culture. when waves of immigrants came to Israel, they had to figure out how to feed themselves, provide work, provide healthcare, provide jobs, provide defense. And there are two ways to do it. You can try to look at how your neighbors are doing it and try to emulate them. We've tried that for a while, didn't work. And so we started, that's where the culture came handy. And the culture allowed us to really start experimentation. And this experimentation allowed us to bring innovative solutions to solve our problems. And so three more things helped in the process. First, the immigration, which is difficult to create homogeneity for the country, but it's great to create sparks. And sparks are very, very useful for innovation. Military service, I've already talked about, that people are thrown into very tough situations at a very early age and asked to solve various problems very, very early. So when they leave at 21, they leave with leadership skills and a lot of experience in solving problems that they didn't think they could solve. That helps in innovation. And the government was useful, surprisingly. The government actually did a lot of things that were very useful and didn't do a lot of things that would have been disastrous. So it helped on both accounts. And finally, in terms of ecosystem requirements, we're now looking sort of strategically. You have to have three pieces of capital. You have to have intellectual capital, ideas that are coming in Israel, coming from the universities, but also from the military. You need to have human capital, and you need to have financial capital to finance it all. We don't have a problem with financial capital. We do have a problem that most of it coming not from Israel. We are struggling with the intellectual capital because a lot of competition worldwide, and we're struggling with the human capital because we need so much of it. But overall, you also need a supportive environment internally. So that's why we decided to set up a policy think tank and advise the government on policy. That's why I resigned from my position at Startup Nation Central and want to start this new policy think tank. But it's not just Israeli case, it's the case in any country, and you need the glue to bring them all together, and you need enough. So for example, the culture comes in the human capital part. So enough people are willing and able to come up with ideas and be willing to take the risks, not to succeed, because when you take risks, you know, in many cases, you don't succeed. That's where the culture comes in. And the government is supposed to provide the supportive environment. So these are my thoughts on what we can learn from the Israeli ecosystem, what we can think about, what are the interesting areas. And now I would just think we should just have a conversation in the remaining time, or I can answer questions or whatever Luciana and Maria decide.
Thank you so much, Eugene. It was amazing, this lecture, and very enlightening in many ways. We are receiving some questions here in the chat. If you didn't send your question, you can send even in Portuguese, we can translate to you. But I will start with the one from Robson Santos. I summarized it a little bit. The question is, do you believe that markets like Brazil will see strong changes in areas of health, transportation, hotels, shopping centers, culture, leisure? There are already some adaptation for sales that we can see in this market, but do you believe there will be a reduction in physical areas and turn to online sales?
So sorry for barking. I'm at home. Part of the new age where you no longer need to apologize too much for this, people. So I think that I tried to say something about this. I think that there will be a significant decline in the use of spaces in the cities, because until today, until Corona, there were two reasons to come to cities. One reason was because of economies of scale, the culture, the health, the better education, you wanted to be where everybody else wanted to be until it became too congested. So that still remains. People still want to hang out in the presence of others, especially younger people want to hang out with other younger people, and so they need places which you don't need to travel 2 hours to find other people like that. But there was another reason, is that the diktat was that people have to be in the same physical space in order to be productive. And so you had to build physical locations, and many of those physical locations were in cities because that's where the young people wanted to locate, etc. So if you wanted to attract those people as your workers, you needed to be in New York or in São Paulo or in Rio, the large, or Tel Aviv in Israel. Suddenly, the second part is no longer true. And there was a lot of costs associated with that dictum, because you either had to pay through the nose for the right to live near your work, or you had to pay in different ways and commute for an hour and a half every day, or 2 hours or 3 hours in order to work where you wanted to work. And so suddenly companies said, wait a minute, we just worked for a year remotely. Google did not get together for over a year. And so suddenly they say, wait a minute, we were not that unproductive. If we suddenly can do two things. First of all, we can reduce the cost of real estate. We can allow people to work from home, and we can build satellite offices in inexpensive places. So if people that lived in, in Long Island and were commuting to New York City, they can now have an office building in Long Island and get there 2-3 times a week. And we're going to do just fine. That is going to distribute. So the real estate is going to decline, in our opinion. It will also going to move, not just decline, but to move. And so the decline in the metropolitan areas of workspace is going to be quite significant, in our opinion. For example, my company, we decided that we're going to work in the office for 3 days, and everyone can work at home for 2 days. If they want to come for those 2 days into the office, they can, but then they need to. So we no longer need so much space. So we have this building, so but we're going to forego the expansion. So that, in my opinion, is going to happen. And if that happens and regional clusters start developing, you're going to see more culture and healthcare and education moving into these regional clusters, because you no longer need to be in the center of the city. So this is going to be an interesting move. It's going to take a few years, but in my opinion, city centers will be populated by much younger people before they start a family, and families will sort of move into much more suburb areas. We had an exodus from Tel Aviv by young families that are moving an hour away, an hour and a half away, and they can afford a house at the cost of a three-room apartment in Tel Aviv. So they're saying, I don't need that. I can be fine with having children play in the backyard, etc. So the answer is yes.
I totally agree. Mauro Zeide sent a question saying, Brazil has an enormous potential market for fintechs, with millions of people still being incorporated to the financial market. How do you evaluate the use of Israeli fintechs in Brazil? What do you need to develop? What do they need to develop their services here in Brazil?
I think Brazil represents, again, I know relatively little about Brazilian economy, so I shouldn't, I'm putting this as a caveat. I've spent a week and a half in Brazil, met with a lot of people, but again, that doesn't make me an expert in it. But what was clear is that the financial industry in Brazil is better developed than in some European countries, or even it's in some areas maybe Israel can learn about some of the things that you guys are doing. The question is how it can be. There are strong institutions, but there are also emerging institutions that are disruptors. So the question is whether the disruptors are going to go after the market of the strong institutions, what the strong institutions going to do about it, or these disruptors are going to go after people who are unbanked or not underserved today. I think today, if we were talking maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, the common wisdom was that the current banks and insurance companies were these dinosaurs, and these little furry animals are going to eat their lunch, and they're going to go extinct. But these dinosaurs grew fur and became red-blooded and adopted technologies, and doing that at an increasing pace. So I don't think that it's any longer a question of putting them out of business. So the more interesting part for disruptors, I think, today is either to disrupt the traditional financial institutional business from within rather than from outside. It's much easier. And the second thing is to go after the populations, both within your country, but also other countries, because if you can figure out how to bring financial inclusion to Brazilian favelas and other places, you can do it in Africa, you can do it in Southeast Asia, you can do it in many other places, building on the strength of Brazilian institutions. So I think it's very interesting for Brazilian ecosystem to connect to Israeli ecosystem and vice versa. It may be even more interesting for Israeli ecosystem in fintech to connect to Brazilian one. There are even some things that Israeli financial institutions been experimenting with some fintech in the last 2-3 years. There could be mutual learnings that can take place. But I think there could be a lot of interesting collaborations in that space if we can set up a platform which makes it easy for both sides to share. Finder could be an useful tool for that. It's free, it's available, but maybe more. And I think that some of the things that the team that Sigalit is on and Daniela leads it could be a good partner to connect through Startup Nation Central to the Israeli fintech.
Okay, we are running out of time. Do we have time for one more question, Maria Rita?
Sure.
I don't think so. But Eugene is not sure, so you can go to one more question.
Okay. I'll go here in the sequence. We have one from Americo. Americo asked, as you know, innovation requires a balance between technology, push and market pull approaches. Since Israel has a small internal market, how do you engage to systematically address worldwide market needs and demands? Is it something you guys do for the entire ecosystem, or companies has to figure out by themselves? How is this?
Well, it's a great question, and the answer is yes and yes. There is when you don't have a local market, and when Israeli ecosystem started growing in the late 80s, Israel was not a market at all. at that time, we were maybe less than 5 million people. So it was a really tiny country and not very advanced in that space. And so they had to figure out how to address the needs of others. And so that's why this is B2B, because it was easier to find clients that were, you talk to one person rather than trying to convince 10,000 customers. They figured it out. There were a lot of connections. I presume that the fact that there's a Jewish diaspora in many developed countries didn't hurt either. But they had to figure it out. The Israeli government has an export institute, which was useful in terms of doing conferences and presentations, etc. And the foreign trade organization at the Ministry of Economy, which is Tzachi is part of, that tried to promote it. But mostly companies had to figure out it on their own. One of the goals for the establishment of Startup Nation Central was to use the network of people that were associated with the organization and do it in a methodical way in places which were harder to reach. And so trying to go to markets where there was a less traction, helping the Foreign Trade Authority, helping the ambassadors in other places. So we were trying a bit different approach, because we are a nonprofit and we are a non-government organization. We don't take money from the government as a rule. We had a lot more flexibility than the government authorities in trying all kinds of things and going after sort of more difficult markets. And but the goal is the same. The goal is trying to connect the challenges that exist elsewhere, make them understood by Israeli technologists, and then try to figure out who can solve them. So it is not coming out of a decision, let's not focus on Israeli market. It comes out of the fact that Israeli market is just too small to start a company to cater to it. So in bigger markets, Brazil is a much bigger market. So you have sort of cage 22. How do you focus on the world when it makes sense for a startup that is founded in Brazil to first address the market of 150 million people, which is, whatever, the 10th or 12th largest economy, I don't remember, in the world. Why should you go outside when you have comparative advantage locally? The question is, how do you make it not to become your golden cage, that you're just comfortable and that's it? You're doing it just for the local market and that's it. And that requires maybe an organizations and processes that are similar to Startup Nation Central, that maybe requires something like Global Finder to make the products and services available, that requires bringing challenges from outside of the world, making it easier for companies to connect. That's a lot of work, but once you break this barrier and you have some success stories, let's say 10, 15 companies suddenly expanding rapidly overseas, that would create the role models for other companies. And if you have these bridges that are relatively easy to cross, you can then anticipate a large crossing by a large number of companies. We're trying to do the same thing in a different direction. We're trying today to build these bridges into emerging markets. So we're working in India, for example, we're working with smallholder farmers. That basically nobody's developing technologies for them because it's too damn hard to work with them. So you're just saying, look, I'm just going to develop a technology for a US market or a Brazilian market where I can talk to somebody who has 1,000 hectares or 10,000 hectares, and I can talk to one person and just deploy my technology rather than to talk to 1,000 farmers, each of whom has 2 hectares. That's not particularly efficient. But if you build a platform, if you build which is what Startup Nation Central is now doing with some partners in India and in Africa, then you suddenly can not only help the existing companies, but you can also incentivize other companies to get to start developing technologies for these markets, because they can see how they can access them. So we would love to discuss this further. If you want, Sigalit here is Sigalit comes from Peru. She works at the Startup Nation Central. She's not Brazilian yet. I don't know whether you speak Portuguese, but she can try. I mean, if anyway, obrigado. Thank you very much for listening. And we're at your service.
Thank you so much, Eugene. Thank you so much, Sigalit, for all the organization, and also Luciana and Cisrahi, because we are not going to be able to do that without you. And it was amazing to hear from you. I have so many insights, so many things that we can do differently. And I really hope that we can meet next year in Israel, see your building and this new Delhi that you said that there is there. Thank you so much for you all for joining us. And please stay tuned, because next month we are having a new one, a new Café con Homus. Bye-bye.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.